just jump right in?
I think we can jump right in. If you want to introduce yourself for the recording, and for anybody else who's joining at the moment, be my guest.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you guys for having me. Thanks, Matt, for having me. My name is Jonathan Moss, for those who don't know me. On Twitter, I'm at JWMoss. Same thing with GitHub. I am outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm an active member of the PowerShell group there, RTP sub. So tonight we'll be talking about REST APIs and what it is, how to use it, things of that nature. So a little bit about me. I'm currently how do I explain this? I tell people I'm a software engineer because it's easier to explain that to them, but I write a lot of code, PowerShell code, for my role. I do a lot of different stuff, but recently it's been REST API involved. So that's what I'll be showing tonight. I've been using, like I said, PowerShell 3 years. If you guys have any questions, feel free to stop me, ask questions. It's hard to gauge sometimes where people are at. So I'll start basic and assume basic, but then go deep if I can. If I won't, then I'll kick it over to Matt because Matt's really smart and he knows what he's talking about. So, and Jeff. So again, thank you guys for coming and joining, and we'll rock and roll. So essentially, I wanted to start out by talking about REST APIs, what it is, what it's not. So the first thing we'll do, so I did have a presentation tonight, a PowerPoint, but that didn't go well last time. I just don't like PowerPoint, so I'm just going to break it down for you. So if you Google what is a REST API, essentially you can read all about it and figure out what it is, but at its core, it is a service that is offered by a application that allows you to read, write, create, delete something. Every time you go to a website, more than likely, if you go to Reddit, penny stocks, I submitted a REST call over HTTP to Reddit, so I'll get information from Reddit that way. REST APIs are, you can do several things with it. You can do a GET request, a PUT request, post delete. So you'll see sometimes if you do REST API CRUD, CRUD stands for create, replace, update, delete. So if I wanted to use an API to create something, replace something, update, delete something, I can do that. So for tonight's purposes, I'll go into how to use really two specific functions that come built into PowerShell. So invoke web request and invoke REST method. So, and this is all live, and I'm Googling right now live, so why not? So invoke web request, invoke REST method are two different functions that come built into Windows PowerShell and PowerShell. There are differences between Windows PowerShell and PowerShell versions with invoke REST method and invoke web request. I might get into that later, but I'll spend a little bit of time talking about invoke web request, but I'll spend most of my time talking about invoke REST method and what that means. But essentially, as you see here, I'll let Microsoft do the job for me, where it explains it gets content from a web page on the internet. It's a very basic understanding or basic explanation of invoke web request. So like I said, if I wanted to search something or go to Reddit or Google and search for SoCal PowerShell, I am doing an invoke web request to google.com, and I'm passing in specific parameters. So I'm getting the result of this information, SoCal PowerShell. That's invoke web request. Invoke REST method is a little more specific, as it does HTTP and HTTP requests to a REST endpoint or a REST web service. So that's essentially a little bit different than invoke web request and invoke REST method, but at its core, that's really the biggest difference. But for me, I don't really like reading about it. I like doing stuff. So let me start doing stuff. So I'm on a Windows 10 computer running terminal with Windows PowerShell, and PowerShell 7. I'll also be using VS Code tonight with a GitHub repository that I have called presentations. So all the code that I will have tonight will be posted to my GitHub repository, and I'll send that to Matt so that you guys have the availability to take a look at that. So any questions so far before I get started? All right, sweet. So one of the cool things that you can do, you know, you can go to Google and go google.com and you can search for Jeffrey Snover, right? And sure, Jeffrey Snover, go to images and go to images right here, and you can do right click, save image as, and do all that, right? So you can obviously use a browser to save an image to your computer. Now, if I wanted to do all of that, but with PowerShell, let me show you how to do that, right? So first of all, I'm getting a URI or URL. In this case, it's from Twitter, and I'll explain what it is in a second. So I'm defining URI as a variable with the URL. I don't know what that's for. I don't know why I did that, but oh, I guess that's where I'm going to store it. So invoke web request. If I hover over it, it has a handful of parameters. I'm going to focus on just a few of these tonight, mainly the URI part. The URI is the URL that you're requesting information from, and in this case, it's this URI right here. And then in this case, tonight, I actually show you a little bit about outfile. Outfile will allow you to save files from a website or a web service to the local disk. So in this case, I'm storing it in temp f pick png. So if I run this, what happens? It will load. So if I wanted to start process, and it starts over here, this is what I get, right? So it's a meme. Please use PowerShell, not the mouse. All right. So what I did there in about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code was I went to a website and downloaded it to my computer and then started it. So I can call this pick 2, pick 3, pick whatever. But this was an embedded picture from Twitter that I grabbed, and that was pretty awesome. And I wanted to show you the outfile part. So invoke web request. If I expand this out further, let me do this better. So method. So if I do invoke web request, method has get, patch, post, put, delete, default, all kind of stuff. But by default, if I don't put the method parameter there, it's a get request. So up here, I did a get request to this URI, and I told PowerShell to output it to a file right here. So that's a very basic way of doing it. Any questions so far about that? I mean, it's super basic, but I just wanted to show you just this part, how you can download a picture. Right. Okay, cool. So this is a lot of fun. So I saw this Reddit comment the other day, and it did such a better job of explaining what a REST API is than I'm probably doing. I'll save this for later and send this to you guys, but I will keep going here. So essentially what happens is when I go to github.com, Moss, I'll browse to my page, and here's my GitHub account. And I have different repositories here, and I have presentations tonight where that code is. But if I read some of the information on the REST API, so GitHub has a REST API. And so, okay, why do you care about a GitHub REST API? Well, in my case, I wanted to show you how I can get a gist? It's like GIF, a gist from GitHub. A gist is a quick script that you can store in GitHub. I have a GitHub account where I have some code here. See all my gists. There's like quick different scripts, some JSON files for the penny stock stuff that I'll show later. So I have a handful of gist files. I have 13 of them, right? So if I wanted to dynamically get all of the gists from GitHub, well, GitHub has a REST API that allows me to do that, right? It has the ability for me to do that. Now, if I go here, let me break this down a little further. I'm going to use invoke REST method to do that. So the URL I'm going to hit is api.github.com. And if I go to api.github.com, it's gonna happen. I don't know what's gonna happen. Yeah, it's gonna say, okay, this doesn't help me, right? But if I go to the documentation, this will help me understand what's going on, right? So how do I get information from GitHub? Well, I use their REST API. Okay, well, how do I use the REST API? Well, GitHub has great documentation along with Microsoft on how to use a REST API with GitHub. In this case, I want to get information regarding the gists from me. So invoke REST method is different in that invoke REST method works within a REST API. So if you know a program offers a REST API, then I suggest using invoke REST method because it does a lot of neat things in the background for you, as opposed to having you parse out information and all that good stuff. I'll show you later how that works. But so in this case, we're going to be using invoke REST method to retrieve all of the gists from my account. Now, if we look up the documentation, it's going to tell us to do one thing, always do one thing. So by default, all requests receive the v3 version of the REST API. So we encourage you to explicitly request this version via the accept header. Now, in invoke REST method, you obviously have the URI, right, which is the URL. Now, another thing that invoke REST method has is headers. Now, headers are key value pairs that you pass to a REST API to get something, create something, update something, or delete something. So in this case, GitHub wants us to pass a specific header. And this is the header right here, accept application VND, yada, 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 yada. Okay. So if you read here, all API access is over HTTPS and access from HTTP GitHub API to github.com. Now, the URL, this is called a base URL. So all API calls to GitHub will start with this URL, api.github.com, right? So if you look here, I'm going to create my headers, and my header rather, and my header is going to store. I'm going to store my header as a variable called URL gists, and remember, this is just a hash table, right? So in that, I'm going to create. Actually, this is the. Let me back up. Let me create the headers by default here. So I will do accept equals application VD. So this right here is a header that GitHub wants in all the calls. So where did that go? Let's do this. So the accept header is this. Now it's not a dot because in our case, it's going to be an equals because key value pairs using hash tables require an equals symbol. So headers accept equals this. Now for the URI, now we already have the base URI, but with APIs, you have what's called endpoints, right? So endpoints allow API services to provide other resources or other information, right? So in this case, we have a resource called like a gist resource, or gist resource. I keep going back and forth. In this case, this is my user account, and this is my gist. So I'm going to combine this with this, and I'm going to create my URL here. So it's actually going to be this. Everything after the slash is my endpoint here. So this is actually technically my URL right here, but it also includes this part right here. Now this highlighted part right here is an endpoint. So what does that mean? You're asking. So if I go to, let's see here, GitHub REST API, just, let's go here. Out of date. Yep, that's fine. If I want to get a gist, what happens? Well, let's keep it simpler. I'm not going to do that. So I know in this case, all it requires for the headers is the accept equals this, and it requires the URI, right? Which in this case is my URL. So I'm going to delete all of this here. I'm going to make this simple for you. So invoke REST method. URI is the URL, right? And the headers, it's going to be the headers. Now what's going to happen is it's going to return a PS custom object to all of my gists. So it should return, let's see here. Where did that go? So it should return all 13. Okay. So if I hit F8 here, it's going to dump all 13. Now let's make this easier by storing this in an array called results. So when I invoke REST method or invoke web request, I receive something. So I send something and then I receive it back. So I'm receiving a response. That's a better way of putting it. So I'm going to run this again, F8. So now my response is an array of objects. So if I do response, blah. Now how many arrays do I have? I have 11, right? Now I don't know why I have 11 and not 13, but I think I'll explain why in a second. I think I'm going to rise. So now if I want to get the first result, I can do index 0 of an array. For those who are not aware, an array is a collection of objects. So if you remember seeing array equals this, so it's like 1, 2, or yellow, blue, right? So this is an array of, let's say strings, right? Yellow, blue, green, red. So what happened here is I received a response from the API endpoint with an array of objects. So what I'm looking at now is my first result. Now, if I look at this and I do get type, it's a PS custom object. So every time you call a REST endpoint with PowerShell using REST method, more than likely it's going to return either a JSON object or it's going to return a PS custom object. I think that's wrong. I think it's always going to return a PS custom object. But certain APIs allow you to return it in different formats. But in this case, it gives us a nice, clean custom object to work with. So if I want the first gist, and I want to see a few things. I want the, let's see here, I want the URL. So I'm going to do URL. There's the URL. Right. Start process. Does it pipe it over? No. Somebody to start process. There is my, oh, that's just going to be the URL itself. So what if I do this? Oh. Open this. Okay, so this is the URL for my gist, but where's the content? If I wanted the content of that, maybe it's not going to give me that. Maybe this REST API just gives me information about the gist itself, like when was it created, what's it called, and so on and so on. If there's comments on it, and other things. So, so what I just showed you is a way to receive information from a REST API that requires specific headers. Now, in this case, I didn't need to do any type of authentication. I could just hit it and go. So there's another gist, for example, another user. I just pop in another user here, right? And it'll get that user's gist, right? Now, if I wanted to do something different and I wanted to, let's say I wanted to pull all the PowerShell repositories PRs, right? I wanted to get all their pull requests, right? I can do that. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to teach. So splatting is awesome. If you do with invoke REST method, I mean, look at that. There's like a lot of parameters. And if I were to type all that out for certain calls, it'd be all the way at the end of the screen. So a feature of PowerShell is called splatting, where you can put all these parameters inside of a hash table and then pass that entire value into the function here. So headers, I'm essentially doing the same thing as I did up here. So this is the same thing up here, but my URI is different. For my URI, it doesn't go to the user's JDown gist. It goes to repos, PowerShell pools. Now I know this because I looked at the REST API ahead of time and I saw where I can pull that information. So if I want to do that, I just run this code right here. Now, if my URL is probably going to be wrong because my URL is not includes the endpoint. So let me type that out. Yep. And then let me do this and go. So that's going to take a bit. All right. Now, so PRs.count 30. Now, 30 is the limit. There's a lot more pull requests on the PowerShell GitHub repository. A lot more. If I go to PowerShell, so 86, right? So REST APIs will limit you sometimes with how many results you can return. You don't want to have some REST APIs will limit you because they don't want you to query 1,000 responses at a time because they don't want you to just hit this REST API so hard that it grinds to a halt. So there's certain features. This is more of an advanced feature that allows you to loop through each result 30 at a time, for example, for GitHub. But in this case, it's giving us the 30 specific pull requests on the repository PowerShell. So if I do PRs, the first PR here, I mean, it gives me a bunch of stuff, right? I mean, it gives me all kinds of data. It gives me the URL of the pull request, right? Right here, I guess. So, maybe it would help if I do H here. It would also help if I do it right. Oh, okay. Maybe I'm not doing it right. Okay. Well, in this case, yeah, issue URL. Maybe that's it. Yep. So certain REST APIs have different outputs, right? But in this case, you see the title of this pull request is increase the daily timeout of Windows Daily Build to 9 minutes. So I'm assuming this pull request is to adjust. Yeah, if you look at the body here, this is whenever Microsoft builds the PowerShell build, they want to increase the Windows build to 90 minutes. So there you go. I dynamically pulled the latest pull requests from the PowerShell repository. So as opposed to, going and seeing, okay, how much is it there? So any questions? That's like a lot so far.
It
is. It is crazy. All right, let's have some more fun. So I'm gonna leave it there. I'll save that. So let's bring it down because that went pretty advanced. So let's break this down a little bit simpler with invoke, web request, and REST methods. So Google, right? So if your internet's down, where do you go first to test if you're online? Right? Google, right? Well, you can do that with PowerShell and a tool called Pester. Some of you guys may not know what Pester is, but Pester is a testing framework that is written in PowerShell. You can use Pester to do all kind of testing, validation, and so on. So in this case, I'm going to run a Pester test that tells me if Google is online, right? So if we're online or not, and if Plex is online, because I use Plex a lot to watch media, and I want to see the status of that. So if I run this line right here, so F8, and if I do clear online, blah, it gives me the output of an invoke web request, which is different, right? It gives me headers, images, raw content, but it also gives me a status code. So this status code is an HTTP code. 200 says you're good, right? You're online. So what I'm doing here is I'm just saying, hey, this status code should be 200, and it is, right? Now, if I go here to the status.plex.tv, this link, it's just one big JSON file, right? So I'm going to query that JSON file, and I'm going to drill into that JSON file, the status and description, and make sure it's all good. So if I do this by hand, so if I do Plex, and if I do, what is this? It's a custom object, right? So I do Plex dot status dot description. We're good. We're online. So Plex is the single sign-on service with Plex is online. So if I run all this, I should get green. Ooh. Ooh. Oh, I'm using the built-in Pester, probably. Yeah. Pester is built into Windows 10. It's an older version. There's newer versions that require the parameter B. That's why that broke. I also have a talk on Pester that I have. I did it with our Raleigh PowerShell group. Pester is amazing, and everybody should learn it. I know a little bit about it, but they just released a new version, Pester 5. But I use it for this simple stuff right here. So what I did is just ran a Pester test that basically used invoke web request and invoke REST method to query 2 sites to make sure they're online. So 16 lines of code to check if my internet is down and Plex is working. So you can write a Pester test every morning to, run this and okay, like is Google online, is Plex work, so on and so on, and you can get all kind of information from REST APIs or websites through this method. So I'll save that back. All right, so that's using just a GET request with Pester, right? So obviously you see we're using Teams tonight. So we have Teams, we have Slack, and we have GroupMe. We have WhatsApp, we have iMessage, we have all kind of 1,000 different social media messaging platforms. One of the things that I use is GroupMe. My friends use GroupMe. I don't know why. I think GroupMe is awful, but I'm going to show you how to use the GroupMe API to send messages, right? So as you see here, I created a chat room called REST API. It's just me, and it's also a bot. And as you can see, I've been testing this information right here. And what I want to do is I want to just send a message on my behalf to a room or a REST API group, right? So if we look here, we'll find the documentation for GroupMe is here. There's their public API, meaning anybody can use it as long as you have these requirements. Now, here's this base URL. Now, this is different than GitHub, but you're always going to have a base URL, right? In this case, it's api.groupme.com/v3. Now, you'll see here that it has curl-x post. For those who use Bash, Python, curl is the way to query REST APIs or endpoints. But in our example, because we're in PowerShell land, invoke web request, invoke REST method works for this. There is a cool PowerShell module, by the way, called curl to PS. It is a PowerShell module that will convert a curl string to an invoke REST method so that you can paste in the big long curl string, and it'll say, oh, this H means header, so it'll actually do the work for you in converting that. So if you ever have an API example that has a curl in it, you can either Google what X post means, or you can also run this PowerShell module to tell you what parameters do I need to send, right? So in this case, it wants me to send the same thing, wants me to send a specific header, right? And it wants me to send some other stuff, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to skip all that because I read the information I know it wants. So here's my base URI. I'm going to post something because I'm posting a message. Now, I'm going to post a message to the REST API group under bot. So if I come here, if I just search for bot, yeah, here we go. I don't want to create a bot. Yeah, I want to post a message from a bot, right? So the request is a post to the endpoint /bots/post. So if I look here, I'll see that my endpoint is /bots/post. And okay, we have that much. Now what does it ask? Now it says you need to send me the bot ID, the text, and the picture URL. Now I don't need a picture URL unless I want to send a picture in my bot. But in this case, I just want to send a message, right? So it needs bot ID and it needs text. So text is easy. Bot ID is a little bit trickier. In this case, I've done the work ahead of time. When I create a bot, it asks me for a bot ID and my access token. So what I have here is I've created a API token that stores the bot ID and password. So the username is essentially some long string. So this is the bot ID, right? And then password is the access token, blah, 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 that's tied to me, my account, which is my email account that I signed up with. So I'm essentially taking this credential, and I'm saving it to bot API, right? So I'm going to send the message saying, we'll do this.
Yeah.
Let's say hello. Is there a question? We're just on mute or unmuted.
I think it was just unmuted.
Okay.
That was
All
Phil
good.
Bossman joining.
Hey, all right. So this is my text, right? So hey, hello, I'm a bot posting from PowerShell. It's just one big string. And here's my bot API, which I've stored ahead of time. And here's my body, right? So let's look how I form this request. So my body in this case, I'm storing it in a variable because it's a hash table. So my text, I don't want to create one. So text, bot ID. Now token, you don't see token in there, right? But I can't post a message without a token. So if I go all the way up here, I see that every single example has something at the very end of it where you have to do a question mark token equals blah. So whenever you see that little question mark after there, and then this right here, this key value, you can actually more than likely pass that into the body of the message. So remember, I have to submit something to this endpoint. So I'm submitting a body to the endpoint bot/post with my text, my bot ID, and my token, right? And then I'm going to convert it all to JSON because it wants me to post in JSON format. JSON format is a very standard format. It's similar to XML, but a lot better. So if I combine all that, so method is post, URI is this right here. I'm combining base URI, which is right here, and then my endpoint, which is right here, and then my body is all this, and then includes the text saying hello, I'm a bot, and so on. So if I do this right, it'll say hello, I'm a bot posting from PowerShell. If I run all of this information right here. So if I do F8, it sent a message to REST API. Now, if I store this in a variable, right? So response. So I'm storing the output of that into response. So I'm doing it again. There you go. Does it again. If I do response, oh, it's blank. Okay. Sometimes it'll return a response here, and then you can check the output in this variable. I don't know why I'm doing it in this case, or why it's not returning that information in this case, but as you can see, I basically said, hey, I'm a bot posting from PowerShell. I submitted a message to a GroupMe group using PowerShell. Now you can see here I have my own account here. So test we. So what I did here is I did the same thing. I just created a secure string. So I said, okay, get my API token, and then I'm doing some other stuff. So now let's go back to the API documentation. And if you go to the right, I want to create a message. All right. So send a message to a group. If you want to attach a message, yada, 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 yada. Okay. If you look at this, you'll say groups, group ID messages. So I want to post to this endpoint. Now, in this case, it says group ID. That probably means what group, right? Because I'm in like 85 groups, right? As an 8. So it wants the group ID. So, okay, well, how do I get the group ID? Well, if I go up here and I just look for groups, let's just groups. Is there a way to get groups? Yeah, here we go. List the authenticated users' active groups. So get groups, right? So if I come, nope, what that? If I come here, I'm going to get that information. I'm going to get the groups that I'm a part of. So I'm going to do the same thing up here, very similarly, but I'm going to pass in a different type of body. And if I do this, now you saw how I didn't have to convert to JSON right here. I just passed in a hash table. Can I do that up here? See, what's cool about invoke REST method is sometimes it will, I think, format it on the way out. Like you don't have to convert it to JSON. Let me try that. Let me just try this again. Let me just remove the whole convert to JSON piece. Yeah, look at that. So without me having to convert this hash table to a JSON file, because remember, when I use this REST API, it wants me to submit this data, do a get request using, like, give me JSON, but I didn't have to do that here. So invoke REST method knew that the body was a hash table, and as it submitted the request, it converted it to JSON for me. So that's cool. I forgot about that part. So that's pretty dope. And one thing that invoke REST method does well is it does that for you. So down here, I did the same thing where I just run F8. And if I look at the variable output, Jonathan's groups, I should see the number of groups I'm a part of. So it has response here. So if I do a get type, it's still an object. And if I do get member, I have meta and I have a response. What's in meta? 200. That looks similar, right? So 200 is probably a status request. So yeah, it worked. So now let's go back up to the root. Now let's go down, drill into response. Blah, here's a bunch of stuff. Now how many of those? 6. So if I wanted to select, so if I look at the first one, nope, I need to drill into response and get the first result. Here's the group name. Here's I don't know what the phone number is. It's not my phone number. Here's the ID. So this is the ID of the group REST API, right? So when I go up here, where's that at? To endpoint. Where did I put that? Did I put that in there somewhere? Oh, okay, well, thought I did. But this ID gives me the information I need to make a successful request to a group, right? So if I do this, this is a user/me. This endpoint gives me some more information. So I want to go to users, me, get details about the authenticated users. Here's your request. Here's a response. So actually, this API documentation will show you what to expect, right? So you should get a response in the form of this object, right? So if I run this request right here using invoke REST method, I should get the bot ID, or sorry, where did that go? I should get my ID, phone number, yada, yada, yada. So if I go here, run this, and I forget Jonathan's Jonathan information response, right? There you go. There's my creator data, there's my email, there's my phone number. MFA, it's false. Well, that's not good. And here's my URL. What's the URL? Yeah, cool. So there's my daughter years ago. So this gives me the information successfully using invoke REST method, right? So this is kind of gross because what it is, it's a bunch of like one-liners and it's kind of hard to follow. I get that. So if you're like me, you're year-end using PowerShell and you're like, okay, this is all like really, really cool, but this is kind of ugly because it's a bunch of random crap. What do? Well, you create a function, right? So in this function, I know that, so if I look back at the API documentation, I know that every request to submit a message as a bot, so if I get a bot, where's bot? Bot, post a message. So every message post from a bot includes bot ID, text, and maybe and picture URL, but it requires these two. So I created a function, and this was a while ago, so I don't know if it's going to work, but I created a function that give it text and give it an API, and it will actually automatically send you a message. So I basically wrapped this API call to the endpoint bot/post. And this is actually old because this doesn't work. And I wrapped essentially all this part or part of this part into a function. But let's try this actually. Now I'm kind of curious. Well, we'll come back to that. But I don't know. Does that make sense? It's already 10:23. This is a lot of information. But I wanted to kind of pause for a bit and kind of get an gauge idea of the virtual room. Is there any questions that we have so far about REST APIs, what it is, what it isn't?
So just an observation. I think I saw a presentation you gave for a different user group, and one of the complaints was having certain APIs where the token would be in the URL string, and I think you addressed that by showing that I guess those same APIs can take it in the body as a parameter.
Yeah, I didn't know that until a few days ago. So I was playing around with. So if you look, what he's saying, guys, is I don't have to put this token equals here. I just can put this in my body file. So if I move this up here, token equals this instead, I can make this much simpler. So what he's saying is this before, I didn't know this because obviously you guys saw my code from the last time. Anything after the endpoint where it starts with a question mark, REST API, key value pairs, you can pass into the body variable or parameter, right? So yeah, that's a great point, and I don't even think I need to convert it here. If I remove this whole part, I don't even need this. I can just say body, right, and then that should work.
So now your token's not in the firewall logs anymore.
Right, my token's not in the firewall logs. Yep. Well, that's another. So that's a whole other aspect that I want to make sure we're all aware of. So I'm just going over public APIs right now. Well, actually, no, I'm not. I'm lying. I'm going over this public API that requires authentication. But there's a whole slew of ways to use REST APIs with authentication. In this case, this API requires a token, right? Some APIs require a token plus a username and password. So it wants not just an API key or token, but it wants your username and password. And some of them want their username and password, and they want to base 64 encode it and then put it into a URL. I mean, most of the challenges with working with REST APIs is the documentation or lack of, and then the method of authentication, right? So if
Hey,
I'm sending,
can I ask a question? That's not going to be going across clear text. I mean, that's going to be encrypted correct?
Correct.
So what is the risk?
The risk is, well, you tell me.
I'm just curious. I mean,
Honestly, the risk is,
if somebody grabs your token, I mean, they can't really use it, correct? I mean, or can
well,
they?
If
they would
it's
have
in the
to,
URL, they could.
yeah, well, they would have to decrypt the HTTPS call on my machine or on the endpoint's machine. And so if I'm doing an HTTP over, now that's bad, right?
Yeah,
So if
that
I'm doing an
I get
HTTPS
that.
call, yeah. So if I'm doing an HTTPS call, the risk is pretty low, right? I mean, it's relatively low. But you got to remember, like I'm using, I mean, when you log into Gmail, when you go to gmail.com, you log in, you're doing a very similar thing that I'm showing you here, where you're passing in your username and password. The REST API is just doing things to encrypt it, right? And we're also just using standard TLS here, right? So the risk is low, but I really wanted to share that I didn't need this URL with, token equals blah and blah, 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 blah. I can pass that into body.
All right. So, and by doing that, the token's not included, you were saying, in some log files on the system that you're.
Well,
Is that correct?
I don't know if that's true. I don't know if you're logging. Well, let's see here. The only way I can think that would be a vulnerability or a risk is if you're inside of a corporate network and they do SSL interception, right? I mean, yes, if you do TLS and SSL interception with HTTPS on an internal endpoint, then yeah, you can decrypt anything. But if you could decrypt TLS traffic, well, then your risk is much higher. So in this case, what I wanted to show was not necessarily that it's not in the URI, because I can put it back there, right? I could put it back and do token equals, this right here, and this still goes over HTTPS.
Sure. I think it's cleaner by putting it in the body. I was just curious as to what the, if there were any security implications on it, but I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize.
No, it's a great question, and it's something that I don't
sorry,
think
go ahead.
so. Yeah.
I was under the impression that the URL was not encrypted, and maybe I'm confusing this with a proxy. So, proxy would definitely know what URL you're hitting.
Yeah, absolutely. A proxy or a TLS decrypted endpoint. Yeah, but for the most part, this stuff right here is pretty universal in how not just PowerShell uses REST APIs, but how everything uses REST APIs. I mean, they may have you put the token in not the body, but the header, right? So there's some that require, remember how with our gist example, they wanted headers. So some of them require token here, right? Some of them require it in the body, right? But in this case, they just want it in the body request. So yeah, no, that's a valid question, and one thing that it's good to know. So let me show you one more thing, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I'll show some cool stuff that we're working on. So let's say you missed all of that. You're like, okay, I missed all of that. How do I know what to do? So in Chrome, this is like the wildest thing ever. Someone will learn something new tonight, and it'll be this. Like if I write this right here, I'm posting a message, right? So I'm posting a message. Now, Chrome sends a REST call over HTTP. If you go to More Tools, Developer Tools, Network, and I'm posting another message. This time it's being shown in Chrome. All right, let's say I'm posting another message, blah. Now, watch this box right here. I'm going to hit enter. Oop. This was my REST call. So if I do copy as PowerShell, I come over here, and I paste that. There's my REST message. So there's my URI. Now, in this case, it's using invoke web request, right? But you see it accepts everything here. So I just sent a message, and I captured the one-liner here, and I copied and pasted it to this. So it tells me my URI. So this is the group ID. Remember from earlier, group ID. It's a post request. Here's all the headers that is in that call. All this stuff is like, okay, you're using on Windows 10 with Chrome. You came from web.groupme. This is stuff that's not needed in our REST method, but it's documented in a web request call, right? This is how when you go to Chrome and log into GroupMe, GroupMe can know that, oh, your user agent is Mozilla, yada, yada, yada. So it knows you're using Chrome, blah, blah, blah. But what I want to show you guys is the body. So this body right here is what I'm after. So if I copy this body, let's just say I'm going to copy this body right here. This is what I'm interested in, right? I got everything else. I'm going to go new file, paste, file, save as. Let's save as a desktop. Let's call this JSON. Send message. I'm going to save this as a JSON file. And it's still borked up. So I'm going to replace the backticks with nothing because that's how we do it. Now, if I go here, deformat document, does this work? It does not work. Why doesn't this work? What's going on here? Message, JSON. Where's my problem? End of file. Well, maybe it just needs to escape this. What is happening here? Oh, derp. So I need to remove the quotes at the very end. Now, if I right-click, format. Here is the JSON request when I send a message as me. And so if I go back here, I just showed you how to submit something in Chrome, for example here, capture the REST call or the web request call using PowerShell and paste it out here and figure out what exactly is happening in the background, right? So in this case, I now know that when I post a message to REST API, I'm sending a message, text, attachments, source GUID. Now, if I go here, and I'm like, okay, what if I Google or if I search source GUID? Well, there you go. There's a bunch of requests. Now, what about text? Probably get a bunch of text. Yeah. So if I go all the way up here and look for send a message, where do I just send a message? Groups. Me. No. Chats maybe. No, I don't want to do that. I want to create. No, I don't want to send that. Where was this here? I want to, create a message. Send a message to a group. So the parameters, oh, here we go. The parameters in this case are as follows. Source GUID right here, which is a randomly generated GUID, which in our case would be something like new GUID. Well, it's a JSON file. I can't do PowerShell here. So let's go back here. It's a text file. Okay, there's my text. Attachments is empty because I'm not attaching anything. So really, I just sent it a source GUID and a text. So I just showed you how to, if you missed all of that and you're like, okay, how do I create a REST API call using PowerShell? Well, you can use Chrome natively to do that. Now, what if I want to do it again, right? So if I want to come down here, more tools, developer tools. Let's go to a fun one, Yahoo Finance. So Yahoo Finance, let's go to a stock that I followed the other day, Mara. And let's go to historical data. And I want to grab this. Now, if I go to more tools, developer tools, and I hit download, there's a bunch of stuff, right? I'm like, oh God. Of course, I'm going to Yahoo. Of course, it's going to complain. Now, if I right-click this, right-click, copy a link address, and if I Oh, I'm cheating. If I paste this over here, what happens? So there's my string. So I'm like, okay, there's a download link for, oh God, what am I doing? There's a download link for the ticker Mara between these two dates. So if I just do invoke REST method, if I just want to just try it, just do that one line, what happens? Okay, well, it looks like it's returning everything I need, but it's not really formatted how I want it to. Well, it's formatted with the CSV. So if I just do this, convert from CSV, wouldn't that give me the data, right? It will. I knew the answer to that question. Blah. So if I come here and say, okay, Mara, run F8, so Mara.count. So 253 results. So if I go to the first result, well, there we go. There's the first result, 8/5/2019. Let's do the last result. Yeah, yesterday or today. Today, it's 8/4. Yeah. So there is something where I just use invoke REST method to dynamically grab the latest Yahoo Finance information about a stock ticker called Mara with the date, the open price, the high, low price, blah, 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 in one line. Right. So all that to say, I've written a PowerShell module called penny stocks. This is where it can get crazy. This is where I've had way too much fun and spent way too much time on this information.
Plug away.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. So it's not public yet, but I have built a PowerShell module called penny stocks that essentially has different wrappers around API calls, right? So Yahoo, Reddit, FinViz. So these two are stock-specific websites. Now, I was kind of playing with it, and as you can see here, I kind of have it down. So I already knew that information because I remember researching this. So I created a function called get PS YF data. PS for penny stock, YF for Yahoo Finance data, right? And I can give it a string, and obviously I'm going to get a stock ticker, so Novin, for example. So what I found is that in Yahoo Finance does not have a public API. They have a private API. But I was like, okay, what about Yahoo Finance API? What's the first result? I don't know, but what if I go to GitHub? Who's written code? Oh, Y Finance. Cool. This guy wrote Python code to pull information from Y Finance. So I did some digging, and I found out how to pull out the historical data of a specific stock ticker from Yahoo Finance. So remember the period 1 and period 2 in the previous call? So that's actually a ISO time. So it's actually seconds. So if I wanted to do like the last 5 months of information from, we could do Mara, for example. So if I wanted to run this right here, I wonder if this works. Boom, it does work. That's awesome. So I'm basically I'm storing the URL in a variable called data, and I'm doing invoke REST method to data, converting it from CSV because I know it outputs a CSV file, and then I'm looping through each object. I'm creating a PS custom object for myself, and I'm using float here. I can probably use int 32. That would make more sense. So if I wanted to do that again, there we go. So all that to say, I am trying to recreate this guy's Python code in PowerShell to retrieve information about stocks. So not only that, but I wanted to figure out some information on Reddit. So Reddit has a REST API, right? Reddit REST API. I'm telling you guys, everything has a REST API. If it doesn't, stop using it. Just kidding. But for example, like I go to like a popular one, like reddit.com/r/sysadmin. It's a very popular subreddit I used to visit a while. So they have a subreddit a thread called Patch Tuesday Mega Thread. So everybody uses Windows here. If you you hate Windows updates, right? Your patch comes out and it just sucks when there's a bad patch out. So these guys come out every month and have a Patch Tuesday Mega Thread. I saw the most wildest code I've ever seen, and it kind of got me addicted to Reddit APIs. I saw this code where this guy will go in, will find the Patch Tuesday Mega Thread, and he'll loop through all of the comments, and he'll match on if it matches a KB article, and will output it for me. So if I run all of this isn't my code, by the way. This is a guy I found, and I was like, this is magical. If I run this will output the KB articles listed in the mega thread, Patch Tuesday mega thread, using the REST API. There's no authentication done here. That's like basically going here and going to reddit.com sysadmin, and it's like going here and saying, okay, I want to search here for, I don't know, KB, or I don't want to say I'm going to do search KB, right? Well, I can do all that. There's 16 different things, but this guy, whoever wrote this, or girl who wrote this, did this all for me. So all that to say, the ability or the use cases for using REST APIs are endless. You can do anything you want with it within reason, as long as you follow the terms and conditions and you authenticate correctly. And if there's not a REST API, you can just do what I did, where you go to the URL and you browse over this and you just work backwards. You copy the link, or you click the link and you see what happens, what pops up here, and you grab the file, copies PowerShell, and there's your request. So you're copying your request. You can also copy the response too, right? So anyway, so penny stocks, whoever said they use Robinhood as well, please start using this. I'm going to publish this. Whoever said that, I want you to help me with this.
I'll be checking it out.
All right, awesome. Yeah, but this is just one use case that I have that I wanted to use. So I'm gonna wrap it up by saying, if there's no way to use a REST API and there's no way to use a invoke web request, there is a tool called Selenium. All right. Selenium is a tool that allows you to automate clicking stuff and doing stuff within Chrome. Like if I wanted to click this right here, right click inspect, if I wanted to find this specific element right here and click it, well, I can automate that using the tool called Selenium. And there's a plug for Raleigh PowerShell group tomorrow night. Stevie is doing a talk on how to use Selenium and PowerShell. And he's probably going to show you and demonstrate this PowerShell module, which uses Selenium, but uses it in a PowerShell-y way to control and grab information from a browser if it doesn't have a invoke web request, a REST API, or something. So it's basically, Selenium gives you a really good way of, I use this term lightly, screen scraping, website scraping, site scraping, something like that. I don't know a lot about it, but I know enough to be dangerous. We have a tool, internal tool, that is super legacy, super old. It's our service desk tool, and I use Selenium to automate creating a ticket without a REST API or anything. I just click, 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 click. Anyway, so if there's no REST API, there's no invoke web request. If you do this and you do the download tools, more tools, developer tools, and you can't figure out what to do, then Selenium is another example. So
Can I just throw something in there?
Yeah,
If you're not
please.
following Adam Driscoll on like Twitter or LinkedIn and stuff like that, you should.
Yeah, Adam
He's
Driscoll's
a bright guy.
great,
Yeah.
yeah, he's a great community member of PowerShell. Writes really great tools. But yeah, this is one that I've only started using recently, and Selenium is a pretty popular tool with application development and application testing. But I've also used it for websites that don't have an API. So, and for other use cases that Stevie will discuss tomorrow in the Raleigh PowerShell group. So
I believe Selenium is very popular also for writing bots for, like you said, for websites that don't have APIs. Like when people
cool.
run questionably, ethical bots on Instagram and stuff like that. That's the kind of tool that they use.
Okay. Well, there you go. There's your answer to the question: how do people do that automatically? Well, Selenium. So, well, cool. That's pretty much it. That's my talk on REST API and kind of going deep into how to use that and Reddit and all that fun stuff. Any questions or anything that you want me to review? Again, I'll post all of this to my GitHub.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So one thing that I find with using REST APIs is actually taking the output and making it into a more readable format. One tool I've used is PS Write HTML or something like that. I was wondering if you've come across anything.
So your question is essentially when you receive information from an endpoint or a REST endpoint, how do you, I guess, format it? Is what you're asking?
Yeah.
Like how do you? Okay. You can use. I mean, the thing is, it depends on the output. So, for example, this guy, it outputted it. What's get type? This is a bunch of arrays, right? So, I can Google like, I don't really know HTML well, but display PowerShell array HTML. Convert array to HTML table. Yeah. So to answer your question, I don't know of a lot of a good method of doing that, but as long as you return an object, a PowerShell object, like a system array, a PS custom object, a hash table, you can do whatever you want with it. But I don't have a recommendation for that. Does anybody else?
I'm curious as to what you're trying to do, because if you're talking to an API, typically the response, as Jonathan said, comes back as a JSON, comes back as a CSV, comes back as just even raw text. So I don't know of anybody who returns back HTML, and so I've never even heard of it, because basically it's a web page. So if you're talking to an API, but if you're actually trying to parse the web page, well, then you go back to what Jonathan was saying with Selenium, and that's a different beast. So I'm interested to hear what your use case is, or if you're, just in theory.
I assumed it was about deserializing the JSON, maybe.
Oh, well, it does that. So that's part of what invoke REST method will do, right? With certain API calls, it will convert that for you into a custom object. Like when we went here, for example, it will automatically return that information for you with as an object, right? So if I did response, okay. So it will more than likely, if you're using a REST endpoint, return a clean object for you to then just do whatever you want with, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and you could also use convert from JSON if you have some special funky parser, like you could probably create your own little.
You don't need to
parser.
Oh, you don't need to. So invoke web request or invoke REST method will actually do that for you. Like
that REST method, but if you just invoke web request, sorry. So.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's
a
good point.
Raw.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me show you an example. Let's try it. Let's just go.
Well, I've seen some legacy also APIs that actually create XML, and so I've had to do some funky stuff with XML, and so you just parse it back into XML. But that's some legacy stuff, and that not really.
Here's a Here's an invoke web request at google.com. What do I get? I get a bunch of crap. So there's the HTML page I just showed you, right? I mean, there's not really much here. Like I'm not doing anything. I'm just going to Google. But if I wanted to search something, well, that would be a whole nother beast. So for the most part, you're going to get clean data from invoke web request and invoke REST method. But if you don't, Selenium is one thing. I will say this. I am using a tool here to do screen scraping a little bit. Not using Selenium, though. I'm using a tool. I don't even know if you guys, Phil, have you heard of this? It's called, what's it called? Crap. HTML Agility Pack. HTML Agility Pack. PowerShell.
Never heard of it.
So how do I explain this? In Windows PowerShell only, when you do invoke web request, it will give you the DOM object, right? And in the newer versions of invoke web request, and it requires the Internet Explorer DOM object or COM object, I forget.
Dom.
But so in newer versions of PowerShell, PowerShell 6 and higher, invoke web request will not give that information. So in websites that don't have an API, like for example this website I use, I've used a PowerShell module by Justin. I forget his last name. It's he presented a while ago on the Windows Terminal. HTML Agility Pack.
Justin Grody?
PowerShell. Yeah, he created a Power HTML. Sorry, there it is. Jeez. Power HTML.
Yeah, and that's Justin Grody.
Grody. Okay. He created a tool that essentially allows you to manipulate HTML specifically, right? So use to parse HTML without requiring IE. Yeah, here we go. So this part right here, you can't do in invoke web request with PowerShell, right? So because I wanted to make this module or this function compatible with, or not compatible with Windows PowerShell, I just used his tool to get the raw HTML data and then find the class. And this is like super deep, by the way, guys. This is not something I figured out really quickly, but all this gross stuff gives you this information. But that is another option in addition to Selenium is Power HTML. And Power HTML is using in the back end is a wrapper around HTML Agility Pack, which is a tool that allows you to retrieve. It's very similar to Selenium, I'll say that, but it's only needed if you need to do some really methodical parsing of data, and you don't want to use Selenium. So, and you don't want to use Windows PowerShell to do it. So that's way deep and way advanced, I think, because I just learned about this literally a few days ago as I'm writing this code. So
Is it basically taking HTML tags and making them more serialized like a?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a
That's pretty
great way
cool.
of putting it.
It's
Yeah.
like what do you call it? Something soup, beautiful soup for Python.
Probably. Yeah, I'm not too familiar with it, but I believe that's the case. Yeah, like there's essentially, if I go to this website, like let me go to this website right here. Like FinViz is pretty popular. If I look at that same ticker, if I want to find like this value right here, well, this value doesn't exist as an API on this website, but it exists in a table inside of an element inside of a blah, 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 you know what I mean? So I figured out how to grab that information out of this website and make it work. So I use that through serializing HTML calls or HTML values. So yeah, very interesting stuff. So cool. Oh wow, we have a lot more people. Sorry, I'm just now looking back at the chat. Any other questions, conversations? Beautiful soup, XML.
I've got one.
Yeah.
Have you played with the Graph API at all? Microsoft Graph API?
Yes. Oh my God. Yes.
I noticed earlier you were you had an example of using the 8061 time format.
Yeah.
ISO 8601, I think. So yeah, I'm kind of like actually at a brick wall where I was about to open a ticket with Microsoft on trying to attach basically upload a certificate to an Azure AD service principal. I'm just curious if you've done that before.
No, what's the link? You want to send me the link to the API documentation? Maybe we can figure it out.
Well, I mean, I didn't mean to take over your whole presentation.
No, that's fine.
That's
I
can
be
probably send it to
genuinely
you offline.
curious. Yeah,
Oh.
send it to me in chat, and I'll look in the background if anybody else doesn't
Yeah.
have any questions. But yeah, I have used the Graph API. I'm more of an administrator for Exchange and Teams and Skype and all that nonsense. So I've used the Graph API in that way. But I'd imagine it's the same way. I mean, it's a very similar way. I don't know. Graph API Explorer. I don't know. Is there? Yeah, service principal resource type. I don't know. You want to create one? Is this part of creating a service principal?
This is part of, well,
Oh, here we go.
yeah. It's basically, so here's the deal. With Azure AD, you can have single sign-on apps, right? And Azure AD
sure.
app can mean so many different things.
Yeah.
It's very confusing. And so you can go to the marketplace and basically create like a new, for example, AWS. You can have Azure AD be the federated partner for logging into an AWS account.
Sure.
Ironically. And we love, we kind of want to go down that direction, move off of ADFS on-prem, et cetera. And so the problem is that I found like the Terraform Azure AD provider can get only so far creating an Azure AD app, can't do anything with the service principal like for SSO.
Okay.
Same thing with PowerShell. PowerShell commandlets for like the Azure AD or the AZ module, neither one of them can go and like create an SSO app. Like I can go attach a cert to just a regular service principal, but if I want to create like an Azure AD SSO app, kind of like I could find from the marketplace, I can't do that. So it turns out you can do this through the REST API. You basically can go call up one of those templates, then instantiate it with a name, and then basically you start building from there. The result of this one post you use to submit another post to configure that app and do various things, add roles, a role manifest, etc. And then finally at the very bottom, one thing that would happen automatically when you create this app in the portal is it would add a self-signed signing certificate, right, for federation.xml.
Right.
That would be like 3 years before it would expire. And it doesn't do that when you do it programmatically. You have to create that cert and go upload, basically do a patch. I don't know if it's a post or a patch request with like your private key and like base 64 encoded.
It's wild.
I can't believe like the hoops I'm jumping through. The time has to be in ISO 8601 or 8061. I can't remember. But basically what you were showing us earlier. But before you do that, convert it to UTC. Have a UTC offset, which I saw you do on one of your code examples, but to Linux format. I thought that was interesting. So anyway, I finally got past like all kinds of stuff, man. I'm past the certificate key and the private key and public key and the format at once and the password and the format at once and the I mean, there's just so many different parameters. And then finally, after everything, I'm getting like kind of like a weird, I don't know, an error that I can't. It's not very descriptive. So I thought I would just see if you'd gone through that successfully before.
Is it with Unix time or is it with just REST API in general with a specific example?
They don't actually say Unix time.
So, by the way, just as a side note, I found this function that will, I think Warren Frame wrote this. They'll basically take a date parameter and convert it and output the Unix time. It's actually much cleaner than the ugly code that I wrote earlier. So just a FYI, I'll put that out there. I need to store that anyway on my, get data. What's that? But no, you have found the very intricacies of dealing with REST APIs and the challenges there, but I have not experienced that level of involvement. We actually have Azure AD configured. We actually configured the Azure AD SAML through, actually, ironically enough, AWS, but never. We did it just through. We just created it manually. Believe it or not, I'm actually one of the few that do that in our tenant. So I actually do know what you're talking about. But in this case, yeah, I have not run into that problem yet with Graph API. It's been pretty clean and pretty easy to use.
Yeah.
Thankfully. But then again, I'm doing mostly in Office 365 and not Azure. This guy right here, Kevin Blumenfield, writes really good code for against the Graph API. I've used his code quite a bit for Graph, so there's a bunch of good stuff. So, but no, to answer your question, I do not. I wish you luck. Sounds awful.
I did put it in the chat.
Oh, here we go.
So one
This
day,
guy right here.
yeah, towards exactly configuring the signing certificate.
This guy. Oh boy. Okay.
I love how they then give you C# as an example right after PowerShell.
Oh my god. Okay, patch. Okay, so what are you sending? Okay, so you're. Oh boy.
Yeah, this is a mess. So I didn't want to hijack your session. I would love to hear your opinion on it, kind of offline, if you manage to take a look at it.
So I have to use Graph to automate configuration of SAML based on it. Yeah. Okay. Right here. All right. Yeah. You got me curious. So you get this request response. So for anybody else that wants to understand, so anytime you do something in the Azure portal or the Office 365 portal, you're doing it using the Graph API. Sorry, I didn't get your name. Jason, was that you?
Yeah, it's Jason.
Okay. Yeah, so Jason is essentially trying to do that using the Graph API with a specific use case that I have not used before. But it sounds to me like the complexity is having to do like several calls, right? Like a post request.
Oh, yeah. It all builds.
A patch. Yep. Ugh, gross. Okay. There are some limitations with REST APIs and doing that. There are some newer technologies to request data from an endpoint. GraphQL. Yeah, versus REST. There you go. Facebook wrote GraphQL. GraphQL like allows you to just hit one endpoint and get a bunch of stuff versus like 1,000 endpoints and get just one thing. But to answer your question, no, I have not seen that. Most of what I can do is like through 2 calls and I get my data and I move on. Unfortunately. So. But yeah, it's always getting better, but I don't know about the search thing. One thing I was planning to do is grabbing all the apps and show when their certs are going to expire. Mike Yen. Yeah, I mean, hell, have you tried, Jason, to do what I was showing you in Chrome, DevTools and all that? Just walk through and copy out all of the requests.
All of the requests.
So I pull up, so more tools, developer tools.
Oh, you mean
click
like
this,
go
click
to
that,
actually?
click that. Yeah, and then basically copy all here. Copy all as PowerShell, and it'll copy all this information.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can also filter this out to only give you certain requests, and then essentially piece it together that way. So that's one thing that you could try, right? So literally walk through doing it in the Azure portal, and every time you do it, do a capture in your network capture here and grab all of the contents and then just work backwards and see if it lines up with this.
The problem you have there, the certificate bit, is all happens behind the scenes. The thing that's very similar though is the behavior. Like when you're going through the wizard, for example, one of the first things you do in the REST API is you go pull down, you figure out what the GUID is, this object ID for their AWS template. You instantiate a version of that yourself, and then you give it a name. That's the only parameter you give it is a name. Same thing in the portal. Then it goes and builds, and in that step, it's creating that certificate. So I don't actually get
Oh.
to submit or interact. Yeah, it does all that for you in the portal.
And so your
But
challenge
that
is
would be a great
but-
idea.
between the two. Yeah, I mean, I honestly I would try that because I am clueless. That is not something I've run into. But yeah, give it a try if you haven't learned about or haven't. Did you know about the Chrome DevTools piece
Oh yeah.
like
Yeah.
this? Okay, cool. Yeah, good. I'm sure you
Yeah, I
have
love
with
it.
that in that advance. But yeah, give that a shot. Thanks, Microsoft, for making it hard for you. Or wait for HashiCorp to release a new version and call it a day, maybe, of Terraform.
Yeah.
So, cool. Any other questions? I mean, I can keep going, keep showing off different stuff. A lot of good. I went kind of really deep. I don't know where everybody stands with REST APIs and kind of any of everybody's skill level, but really great tool to have. Very powerful. So
I really liked that you went over a bunch of different APIs and showed what authentication looks like for different sites and stuff like that. I think that's a huge barrier for some, is understanding like just each step of the process for, you know, how to authenticate, how to continuously use a token and stuff like that. So that was a good overview.
yeah, awesome. Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
There is one thing that I constantly run into, and I think you kind of alluded to it earlier, and that is where they try to make you page your results.
Oh, yes. There is a. It depends on how do I explain this? It depends on the REST API. The REST API they can publish something called the follow link or follow relink or follow something,
Mhm.
where all you got to do in the newer versions of invoke REST method is put like a parameter. I forget what it is. I know there's a feature. I know in the Graph API there's a really easy way of looking at it. I don't recall. Where do they invoke?
If it's a simple parameter, that would be amazing. Most of the time, I have to write code to look for the presence of a header object, and
Yeah, exactly. There we go. There we go.
maximum follow. Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, pagination. There you go.
I wanted to catch Jeremy Brainerd's question from chat about storing secrets. So the way I interpreted that question actually was, if you're not storing your secrets like alongside your code, where do you store your secrets? So there's a number of different tools out there
Okay.
for that. Like the easiest way to do it is whatever app you're writing, or if you're using a module that requires a token for something like that. Specifically recently in a Discord bot that I wrote in Python, I just, as part of the config file, it's in YAML, and I just say, hey, put your secret in there. Obviously it's in plain text, but it's on the server. You know, it's not sitting in people's browsers. So people in theory can't see it unless they have shell access to my server, which would be bad anyway. And then yes, the next thing that was just said in chat was Vault. So I'm using Vault at work right now for another project, and that is a great option. The trick with Vault is that you also need a token to get the Vault. So there's a lot of like tokens on tokens on tokens when you go down the secret storage rabbit hole, but a lot of it is very easy to get accustomed to in the end.
Pretty sure they have a module, Jeremy, that has their version, kind of a framework. Yeah. Have you seen this? You may be referencing this. I haven't used this myself. Built-in local vault. Yeah, Credman. I think it's just for Windows though. Yeah, here we go. But yeah, I'm with Jason. And we have Jenkins, and we have a credential vault in Jenkins at work. There's another legacy tool that we could use, has a REST API. I would love to use Vault or Azure Key Vault or a better product, but again, I don't have access to that. But
My,
yes,
my big gripe with Key Vault is there's like only 2 fields, and
Oh, is it
only
right?
one that's
Okay.
protected. Yeah, it's like you can't. I guess like I'm, for example, CyberArk. I don't know if you guys have ever messed with
Oh.
that, but you can have a schema that's got tenant ID, application ID, all these different things. That your secret's more than just one field, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't used Azure Key Vault because we're mostly an on-prem shop, unfortunately. So I don't have experience with that. But that is annoying.
You're not missing much. Also, if you have a certificate, you can import one or have it create one for you. But when you export it, it doesn't have a password on it.
Oh, that's not good.
No.
Yikes.
Rebuild it. I'm going through that right now.
You're in the
Like,
weeds.
How do I rebuild it without putting it in a My Store? Because I'm trying to do all this in Azure Automation. I gave up on
Right.
Azure Functions. That's a mess for PowerShell anyway. But yeah.
Not missing much then. So Jenkins isn't much better. Let's put it that way. Cool. Yeah, that's who else is using REST APIs in their environment, or who else has exposure to it and wants to kind of talk about their experience with PowerShell, at least, if you can. Well, good. I hope everybody learned something then.
The best use case I had in my previous role in desktop support with PowerShell and REST APIs was we had this problem where our network switches had certain ports that had speed limitations on them as part of a bug, so they couldn't get over 100 megs. And that was obviously a problem, but just logging into a PC, you wouldn't, or like accessing simple websites, you wouldn't really notice. But once developers would start and they would start pulling down code repos and gigs and gigs and gigs of assets, all of a sudden they'd notice that it was slow, and we would do a speed test on the port, and it wouldn't be good. So my boss wanted an easy way for us to figure out how, if a port was slow, and to report on it into at the time we had a WebEx Teams chat room that we all were part of for deployments, and to easily report into that chat. And we were doing that by hand for a while, and I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. So I found a speed testing tool, a bandwidth testing tool called iPerf,
yeah.
which is very popular. And there is a chocolatey repo for iPerf. And so what I would do with this script is I had an iPerf server running in our VMware infrastructure on a Windows host that I set up, and then I had the script install iPerf through chocolatey. I believe it was a NuGet feed that I installed, or that I set up in PowerShell. It would download iPerf. It would run a speed test against the server that I had set up, and then it would ping the Teams channel with like colored text, like if it was bad, if it was under a certain threshold, if it was over a certain threshold, what the user's host name was, and everything like that. And so it was all you had to do was right click the script and go, and it was much faster than doing all of that by hand. So the API for WebEx Teams was my first exposure to REST APIs with PowerShell.
Oh, for WebEx Teams. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that ancient thing that few people use anymore.
Right. Yeah. Right. Wow. That's pretty cool. That's awesome. Yeah, using it with messaging applications are pretty powerful. We don't have that feature yet because we're not in Teams yet, but I'm really looking forward to that use case.
There's a great module for anyone who's not aware. Hitting REST APIs, obviously, if you're developing your own module, like Jonathan is with the financial tracker stuff, that obviously you need to work with REST APIs directly with that. But for a lot of REST APIs out there, right, there's already modules that exist. And one of the best PowerShell modules that I'm aware of for chatbots is called PoshBot. And it was written by another member of the community. His name escapes me immediately at the moment. without looking it up. But he has
Black Ops. Yeah.
Yes. He has support for, I believe, Discord and Slack and a whole bunch of other stuff in the bot, and you can set it up. It's basically a framework for writing your own chatbot with PowerShell. And that is like if you're doing like deployment tracking where you want your Jenkins execution that's running a PowerShell script to hit a chat room with like deployment status updates and things like that, or at different points of the execution of a deployment, that is a great module to get started with and get familiar with.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, Brandon. Yeah, it's a very popular module. I haven't used it yet, but I intend to once we move over to Teams. Yeah, Teams. I know they recently added Discord as well. I remember reading about that. Yeah, Discord, Slack, and Teams. Yep.
So I threw one in the chat that I use pretty often in the summer. I have a couple of dogs that you would think they're Siberian Huskies. You would think they would like water, but they only like water that's like 5 or 6 inches deep. So there's a spot of the river that I go to, and it got annoying driving all the way out there just to find out it was too high. And I found out that the Chattahoochee River in Georgia is monitored at various points. And so I found monitoring data for the water level, among other things, temperature, flow, all that good stuff. But I know that at this particular point, at this particular monitoring station where it's, if it says like it's 1.6 feet to say 3 feet, that's like the perfect range for them. Also coincidentally great for fishing. So yeah.
So in your case, you're doing an invoke. Okay, so you're doing an invoke REST method and getting an XML response, from what I can tell. Is that what's happening?
It's been a long time since I've messed with it.
I think you posted it here, right? I think in the chat.
I didn't think the response was XML. I thought, in fact,
or is it
in the URL? I'm saying WaterML, so maybe that's why.
Yeah. Yeah, XML response. So just like
so
Phil said earlier.
I could have just said invoke web request then, or web service proxy too, right?
You don't want a web service proxy. That's legacy.
Don't mess with that.
Yeah, don't do that. Unless you're doing SOAP calls, and then that's worse.
I wonder why I skipped to REST method if it's not bringing JSON back. Because it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, it gets it. I mean, if you do a invoke REST method, it'll parse it out for you. Apparently, water.timeSeries.
Yeah, that was a little weird.
Very well. Oh. Cool. So you use it to track water. I use it to track water height. I use it to track penny stocks. You can do anything with the REST APIs.
Oh yeah.
Anybody else use REST APIs or have any ideas or any use cases that you're now thinking about?
I don't know about others, but I use 2 of my previous companies that I used to work for and use their REST APIs in order for them to talk to each other.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's one way of doing it. Like literally? They would literally use a REST API to message back and forth?
Well, it's better than like using the SOAP API inside of Tanium. And since Splunk API, which was my previous company before that, he already has a REST API. And I was working on the module for that before I left. I'm like, well, screw that. I'll just use the REST API at this point.
Yeah, that's one way of doing it. That's funny. I used we're starting to use a lot more of it. So I manage our onboarding and offboarding script, or help manage the onboarding and offboarding script in my company, and we have like 1,000 different services to onboard someone into. So I'm definitely hitting it a lot more, especially SaaS applications. Curtis, I use it to keep track of. Nice. Curtis, what are your thoughts on SharePoint and Office 365 and the PowerShell support? Twitch. Yeah, right. Yeah. Not a thought. Yeah. There you go. Yeah, if you say SharePoint, I'm so sorry. SharePoint and PowerShell as API used to work on SharePoint. Oh. We won't blame you, Jeff. That's pretty funny. No, I even think SharePoint is now behind the Graph API. I think. I mean, I hope. API, SharePoint. Yeah. I mean, yeah, there you go. Yeah, Graph API is awesome, except when it's not, when you're having to do certificates with service principals. So. Love it. Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm gonna hang out, answer questions, just hang out for a bit. I got time. Work on some code. You know, the usual. Work on my penny stocks code.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. That was great.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, hopefully you learned something or everybody learned something.
I'll go ahead and stop the recording.
Hey, Jonathan.